Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on a rainy November morning. So let me start off by underlining that we acknowledge and respect the Colombian speaking peoples here whose territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Song peoples whose traditional territory to this land continues to this day. And I think Abigail has also a lot to say about this issue, but today you will focus on your current research. But this gives me the opportunity to introduce Abigail. It's a real pleasure having you here. You know, if you could switch the slides. So Abigail, as you probably figured out, she is a professor in the Department of Political Science, and she brings a new research project to the center. I think we've come back and forth what you should present, whether it's a safer bet to go back to an older paper that speaks to your broader expertise in identity politics, or focus on your current research. So I'm actually glad that you will do the latter. But let me introduce Abigail. You can see here she has a very distinguished career, with research fellowships around the world, teaching master classes also on identity politics. And probably the best way to introduce her broader field of expertise is if I just introduce three of her last book titles. It gives you a sense of how Abigail tries to explore identity politics from a theoretical perspective, one that looks at democracy, how it operates, what the potential is of identity politics in terms of its divisiveness, but also of pushing forward emancipatory politics, and the role of pluralism in politics. So in 2009, she published the book Reasons of Identity, a Normative Guide to the Political and Legal Assessment of Identity Claims of Oxford University Press. You can see here identity claims being at the center to your talk, also many classes in political science. And then two co-edited books, Identity Politics in the Public Realm, Bring Institutions Back In. So how do institutions cope with identity claims of particular groups? And in 2014, Recognition versus Self-Determination, Dilemmas of Emancipatory Politics, also thinking about the implication for politics and democracy, very timely, if you look around the world, identity claims have definitely become a major factor in determining politics. But it's such a pleasure, Abigail, that you bring your new research to us today, and we're all very excited to hear about it. I know you're excited about it, and I'm sure you can share this excitement with us.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for that marvelous introduction. I'm very grateful. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm grateful. I'm sure everybody in the room who's associated with the center can say the same thing. How grateful they are to have a chance to be in the center, which is a great place. And it's a great place partly because Oliver and Jody and Stephanie and all the people who are around. It's just Amanda and Jen, who is I see zooming in, and all the fellows. So I'm really grateful to be here. It's just it's been a good year so far, and I want to thank the center for making that happen. So here is the new project. It's called Lost Voices of the Commons, and today what I'm going to do is talk about one of the people who I'm looking at. I'm looking at a series of women from the early 20th century who had different ideas of the commons. Now, spoiler alert, actually not spoiler alert, I haven't done a lot of research on the commons yet. I mean, I know a lot, but I haven't actually, I don't want to look at these people as contributing to something that really didn't come, was developed really well in the 1960s and 70s. I don't want to impose that on them. So I'm looking at them for what they contributed at the time that they contributed it. And that means putting their ideas in the context of the early 20th century, which I'm going to talk about a bit today. So why can oh, there we go. Here are the women I'm looking at. Three women: Mary Follett, Laura Kellogg, Ella Baker. Today I'm going to talk about Mary Follett. And her I can answer questions about Laura Kellogg, who I'm just gonna start writing a chapter on now. She's Oneida First Nations person in New York State and Wisconsin. Also in the 1920s, wrote a book called Our American Democracy, which was very influenced by the progressivist era in the United States, as well as by Haudenosaunee ideas, and argued for indigenous self-determination. And then Ella Baker, who was a director of the Students for Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, that was one of the committees that contributed to the organizational foundations of Martin Luther King's civil rights movement in the United States. And she's also someone who doesn't get a lot of play. So let's look at Mary Follett. So Mary Follett, 4 things are important about her biography. One, besides the fact that she's from Massachusetts, and so she was born near Boston, and she spent most of her life in Boston. She was educated at Cambridge University in England for part of her education, but mostly she was educated at Harvard's Annex for Women, that is now called Radcliffe. And she wrote a thesis at the time, I guess an undergraduate thesis that would have been called, maybe because they didn't give women doctorate degrees. On the speaker's position in the House of Representatives. People who influenced her included William James, Josiah Royce, Peirce, all the pragmatists that were around at the time, Edwin Holt, who was one of the people responsible for bringing Freud's theories to the United States. So these were the kinds of, this was the crowd she was interested in. And she retained her supervisor, who was a guy named, who she had a close relationship, Albert Bushnell Hart, was a Harvard historian. He was also the supervisor 10 years previous to W.E.B. Du Bois. And he was also the supervisor of Franklin Roosevelt. So she moved in a kind of a fascinating group, but she was a woman who could not get a position at Harvard. She could not get a PhD at Harvard, yet she retained a connection to that place throughout her life. And you can see she died relatively young, not really old, not really young, but looking really young to me, but nonetheless, relatively young. And, but she ended up, what she did mostly in her work is she was profoundly socially engaged, especially early on. So she worked in the Boston settlement movement, which was a movement to integrate poor working class immigrants into civic society. And there she saw, she worked in the Roxbury neighborhood, which was that kind of neighborhood. She saw that specifically young men were not well integrated. And so she developed programs to bring them in, teach them civics, get them, actually she started a debating club for them, to develop in them key skills of citizenship. But she didn't believe that the settlement movement created community. And that's what she was interested in. So what she did is she lobbied the public school board in Boston to open schools after hours. And she developed programs in these schools. And these were the first community centers in the United States. So she called them her beloved centers, and she started, along with a lot of other people, a community centers movement, which ended up, giving us Oak Bay Rapid. I mean, it was the movement that started the idea of community centers, which was an idea to create community, which was really what she was interested in. Through those centers, she developed consulting and job placement services for the community. She engaged in mediation with people and labor negotiation. And at one point in 1920, she was appointed to the minimum wage board in Boston. And that led to her interest in labor negotiations, which she became an expert in. And so her expertise in labor negotiations led her to I mean, maybe she was hired as a labor consultant, not so much. That profession was just developing at the time, but she was invited to go on tours of Britain and the United States, lecturing on labor management relations. And she was the first woman to lecture at the London School of Economics. So she was also the author of 2 books, 1918 and 1924, including many articles and dozens of lectures, all of which we still have, some of which are about business management relations, some of which are more philosophical. And this person was prolific. So what's amazing is that this is how she's remembered. So she's remembered in an anecdote in this book, primarily. I don't want to exaggerate. There are other people who have remembered her, but this is the book that comes out of the Harvard negotiation project, Getting to Yes. Mary Follett is sometimes credited with the idea of the win-win solution, which is also coming from Harvard. And I won't go through what the anecdote is that starts this book or that's in the intro to this book, but let me say it's quite distant from, in some ways, from the Mary Follett that I ended up studying. And so the question that I'm going to broach in this presentation closer to the end is, what happened to this person who actually had such a fascinating philosophical career and was such a radical socialist Democrat? How did she become this fixture within liberal capitalist negotiation theory? Okay, so first some context as to when this person wrote and lived. 1914 to 1918 was World War I. This is exactly when Follett would have been at Harvard or at Radcliffe. Maybe a little later, actually, but around the time she was writing. It was, of course, an especially violent war, and the violence was viewed as affecting the societies that were engaged in it. The United States entered World War I in 1917, not 1914, so the United States was involved for only 1 year. It was also the time of Black migration from the South to the North and West in the United States, and a time of profound racial conflict. So race riots broke out in dozens of American cities in the post-World War I period. Anti-immigrant groups actively agitated communities in Boston, New York, and Chicago, so much so that after the war, federal troops were deployed to march in the streets of these cities, traumatizing people, but in order to display the state's capacity to keep the peace at a time when no one thought that was necessary. It was also the time of probably the most violent labor conflict in American history. In 1919, 400,000 workers walk off, general strikes in Seattle. In Winnipeg, there's a general strike in 1919. There's the famous Boston police strike. There's the coal and steel workers throughout the United States that go on strike. In 1922, 1.6 million workers are on strike. And these strikes take place after this particular incident, which you might know of, called the Ludlow Massacre. The massacre is kind of interesting an interesting tangent that I want to explain for a second, because it's going on in Colorado in 1914 at the Colorado Coal and Steel plant. This is a plant that is owned by John Rockefeller Jr. and part of the Rockefeller Foundation. The companies all these companies, given the kind of labor strikes that they were faced with, used to hire militias, private militias, to kind of keep labor away from, or keep strikers away during the strikes, and to disassemble people. In this case, the strikers had set up camps on company grounds because they were evicted from company houses because they were on strike. So they went on strike, they were evicted from company-owned houses. They and their families came to populate the area around the Colorado Coal and Steel, and the militia one morning fired on them, killing 44 men, women, and children, and creating quite a publicity nightmare for John Rockefeller Jr. So Rockefeller ended up hiring this man, who you might recognize as Canada's longest serving prime minister, John Mackenzie King. Also a Harvard graduate, just 10 years before Follett. He was an industrial consultant, and he's a kind of an interesting, again, tangent in this story, because what he proposed was the first, he proposed that workers be allowed to represent their interests in management decisions. And that was, they set up worker councils in this, and that was really the first time that these councils came online, was because of Mackenzie King's proposal. He's also important because his dissertation, which was in economics, is a fascinating piece of work. Expresses what something that you see in the thinkers of this period, which is the idea that the violence that is going on internationally is affecting the domestic scene. And so in 1918, Mackenzie King wrote that the law of blood and death, here I quote, structures relations between states and taints all social relations with fear, competitiveness, and antagonism. Industry has been used, he argued, to destroy humanity. Now, these words reflect exactly what Follett thought, and what became an important part in her thought, that the violence around you ends up permeating our psyches, and that antagonism and competitiveness taint all social relations. From this perspective, the solution to industrial conflict, which Follett was interested in, and international conflict were connected, and both required a new approach. So there are really two dominant approaches at the time to labor conflict. One was that labor needed more power because there was a massive imbalance in the power between what capital had and what labor had. And so many unions at the time accepted the ground rules of capitalism, such as freedom to contract, the naturalness of the marketplace, the inevitability of the market conflict, and the legitimacy of competitive freedom. These were all values that were accepted by unions. They were not operating outside of that box. But what they thought is that unions needed more power, and that's what a lot of the negotiations were about. The other perspective was called Taylorism. And this was the idea that the conflict between labor and capital was because of the random power of managers and the random power of owners and militias, and that what we needed is you needed scientific techniques to manage the workplace. And with those scientific techniques, you would get rid of conflict, and you would nonetheless have efficiency in terms of production. So Taylorism changed. It started off being a kind of an awful thing that I can talk about, but it ended up changing to be something that was very sensitive to worker representation and worker consultation. The idea is that part of the scientific technique was input. And so consultation with workers was incredibly important to the process. Now, Follett rejected both of these ways of looking at it. First of all, with respect to the balance of power idea, the competitiveness idea that unions favored, she said that conflict could not be constructively solved through struggles based on competition. The rules of capitalism, she said, must be restructured to promote cooperation and collaboration and to meet the interests of both labor and capital. She believed you cannot be for labor. You can be for labor without being against capital. And so this is not a Marxist view, right? You can be for labor without being against capital by bringing the parties together and having them collaborate to develop a joint understanding of their situation. So labor and capital, she argued, can never be reconciled as long as labor persists in thinking that there's a capitalist point of view and capitalists that there's a labor point of view. There is not. These are imaginary wholes which must be broken up before capital and labor can cooperate. So the idea is that you need to break down the silos of these groups. You reject the idea of competition. Competition is bad. Balance of power is bad. These are not solutions that she thought were appropriate to conflict, and these are not solutions that she thought were appropriate to conflict internationally either. Consent, she thought, was also completely wrong, and here she looked at electoral systems and she thought electoral politics was not democratic. She favored the suffrage for women, but she didn't think the vote was the way to make American democracy more democratic, because she thought that democracy was really in community and it had to exist between relations that we have to each other. So she said that consent and representation don't change relations of power, but rather instead fix them. And that ideas like consent are just become about persuading people. The art of persuasion is a method of obtaining consent, but it's usually merely a method of obtaining power over people. And so she was very skeptical about that. Okay, so that's the background. Let me explain to you three of her key ideas. And the last 3 points are how she applied these ideas. Oh, and I need someone to give me time because I guess I could go like this, but I have no idea when I started.
It's just 11 o'clock.
Yeah, don't feel rushed at all. Fascinating story, so
Okay.
take your time.
Okay, so here's the nuts and bolts of this theory, though, which is maybe a little. So she's a philosopher. So this person is a philosopher, and so but she's very interdisciplinary in the way in which she understands what she's doing, and she's very socially engaged. These things come together. A recent article has talked about her as a public philosopher in this sense. But there are 3 basic ideas at the heart of her theory. The first is that community is a circular process. Okay, so this is an idea that comes from the relational psychology of the time. And the idea is that what Follett is interested in is the way in which groups are made and the way in which people interact in groups. She became fascinated by group processes like we're engaging in now, as soon as the discussion actually starts, right? And so she said that groups are created through a kind of a psychological alchemy of social relations, that we create groups. And they're processes in the sense that they are not linear, they keep on going. The reason is because what happens is that people come together and interact through joint projects and collaborative dialogue. They engage in dialogue with each other in their neighborhoods, in seminars, in the workplace, in community meetings. And through their interaction, they create a new formation, a group. Okay, so the group is created through our formation rather than our physical assembly. These group formations, our group, changes all of us. So we are changed in relation to each other. And so by the end of this meeting, we will all be slightly changed and go off to our other groups with the way in which ourselves have changed and contribute to other groups. But also this has changed. So what this was at 10:30 is different from what this will be at 12. The literal group we have has formed something new, a new something. And in that context, new ideas will arise, not new ideas I tell you, but new ideas that we have through dialogue. And those things she was fascinated by. Those are the creative creations of groups. That groups, through the synergy we have with each other, through the formation of our relations, they create something new. They are innovative. And the idea of creative experience, which was the title of her second book, was all about that, the creation of something new. This is a circular process because it's a process that just keeps on going and changing. It's fluid. There's no linear endpoint to it. And she was very against linearity and endpoints. It's all about process. And by the way, for those people who do know philosophy, this process view ends up being picked up by Alfred North Whitehead, who ended up coming to Harvard, and Follett included him in a seminar, a graduate seminar that she organized. But he's the process philosophy thinker. So the process is creative because from it emerges something new, which would not exist without the joint experiences and activities of the community. Here's what she said. I don't know if I have a slide on this. No. How do I previous? Sorry. We are creating each other all the time. In the very process, by the very process of meeting, we both become something different. So creativity and innovation occur because individuals are always responding to the relation and activity between the individual and the community, rather than to an unchanging set of circumstances. When people deliberate to solve a problem, she argued, free of pressure to concede or compromise, they can arrive at a new idea, which is both the idea of the group and their own idea. These creative solutions to conflict are produced through integrative processes of interaction. We actually integrate, and that's what she meant by integration. Like we actually become something different as a result of the group dynamic. And the solutions should meet, if we do it properly, the genuine interests of all actors, but the actors have changed in the course of their interaction. So the circular process is a pathway to changing our relations with each other and the relations between groups. My changing activity is a response to an activity which is also changing. My behavior is a response to a new situation, which in part I have created. That's a quote from her. So this is this constantly changing idea. In this context, compromise is anathema to the con. So in addition to balance of power, she was strongly opposed to compromise. Compromise in the interaction between people, between states, is a real second best solution that she viewed as futile and short-sighted. In compromise, I say there is no qualitative change in our thinking. Partisanship starves our nature. I am so intent on my own values that other values have got starved out of me. This represents a loss in my nature, in the whole quality of my personality. Through an interpenetrating of understanding, that is the integration process, the quality of one's own thinking is changed. We are sensitized to an appreciation of other values. By not interpenetrating, by simply lining up values and conceding some for the sake of getting the agreement necessary for action, our thinking stays just where it was. In integration, all the overtones of value are utilized. So that's integration, and that's the idea of integration that she had in mind. The second part of, the second idea I want to just review a bit is the idea of diversity conflict. And I've already talked about compromise a bit, but for her, and this is someone who wrote at a time of the race riots and ethnic tensions, she was very well aware of this. She doesn't talk as much about this as some of her colleagues at the time, like Ralph Bourne and Kalin, who were also at Harvard in the area talking. But she was, and who developed a kind of a nascent multiculturalism to respond to social diversity in places like Chicago and Boston in the north of the United States. But Follett went beyond this to say that difference isn't just something that, you know, is good for the social fabric and that we should figure out how to accommodate. It is absolutely essential for any kind of creativity and social innovation within a society. We cannot think of difference, she says, as that which divides us, but rather as that which unites us. And differences must be integrated, not annihilated nor absorbed. So Follett's interest in diversity and integration at the societal level was related to her interest in group processes and group decision-making, where individuals with differing experiences, aims, and values have to come to make a decision. Whether one way or another, so integration might be limited because the experiences and values of those who contribute to it are resistant to each other, so it has to be something we're open to. And it might also be limited because the project that we engage in, the dialogue, doesn't require us to become so fully united with each other. We might be interested in just this seminar and then go off and lead our lives in other ways. We might be interested in developing a cooperative banking scheme, which might involve us more in each other's stuff. But the project that we're involved with matters very much. But what's important in all those contexts is that we open ourselves up to diversity. Diversity is not a negative in this. Antagonism is the negative. Diversity is a very, very good thing and is required for social innovation. Okay, so, and by the way, she also said that diversity, yes, it leads to conflict. All diversity leads to conflict, not just ethnic diversity. But conflict is something that that you can never not face. She said people have to be open to conflict. The point is to create constructive ways of dealing with conflict. But conflict is great because it's through conflict that we create social innovation. So conflict is something that we should embrace, that we should welcome, but it's just how we're going to deal with conflict so that we understand it in terms of diversity and not in terms of antagonism. Finally, power with and power over. So Follett is probably best known for this distinction between power with and power over. She's the originator of the distinction. The distinction has inspired a feminist approach to power in the 1980s and 90s. Nancy Hartstock was citing Follett, said that because men experience power as domination and control, they define power in terms of power over others, over external nature. By contrast, power for women is typically accessible through relations to others, through the activity between actors, and as a capacity that one creates with others in order to access certain privileges. So that's not how Follett did not view this as a feminist contribution. She just viewed it as a contribution as something that happens in integration, and her ideas were formed by it. In Follett's work, power with is jointly developed power. It's a coactive, not a coercive power. And she says, genuine power can only be grown. It will slip from every arbitrary hand that grasps it. For genuine power is not coercive control, but coactive control. Coercive power is the curse of the universe. Proactive power, the enrichment and advancement of every human soul. So power with or coactive power was something that she says we experience it all the time. We experience it all the time, actually. But nonetheless, we have to learn to recognize it. In Follett's view, just as integrative processes have to be something you recognize, that you have to be open to, power with is something you have to recognize. And we don't. She says we don't understand our own codependence. And so we're kind of blind to power with. Also, like integration processes, power with does not subsume individuals to groups. Power with is genuinely non-dominating as a kind of power. We have to be open to it upon entering relations with others, and it's reaffirmed through our successful cooperation. It's experienced in deliberation, it's experienced in small-scale democratic practice, but also it informs political relations in our communities, municipalities, and possibly even in states. Follett believed that integrative power with relations could be established in neighborhoods, and once that happens, it could be expanded to cooperative societies, and then labor organizations, and then municipal movements, where people continue to learn and practice reciprocal, integrative collaboration and dialogue in their everyday lives. She applied these ideas. She thought that the neighborhood was the epicenter of democracy, and that from the neighborhood you could grow a state, the new state, which was her first publication. But the states we have now were not genuine. They're basically examples of power over. So Follett recognized that power over ideology crowds out power with. She argued that our social discourse, psychological theories, political concepts, social expectations, our institutions are all informed by understanding power in terms of power over. Even when we recognize the benefits of cooperation, she argued, we continue to believe that cooperative relations require giving up some of our power and compromising with others compromising our interests in order to cooperate. This blindness is cultivated through competitive and coercive relations, then drilled into our social relations. Our social discourse, she argued, and our political concepts are conduits for power over values. And these values then end up becoming secured in the relations between states, between industry and labor, and in the organization of electoral politics. We come to believe that, and this should be familiar, that conflict can only be resolved by domination, by balance of power, or by compromise. And all of those means of solving problems and conflict are futile and short-sighted, that we fail to see alternatives that deploy power with. Okay, so those are the main ideas of Follett, and here are some applications of her views. So first of all, whether some people have mentioned her names, many not, but she is cited, and the idea of power over and power with is cited by a number of political theorists. You can see them. But here I want to just explain to you how she applied this to labor-capital relations, and then how it ended up being picked up by nonviolent movements in the 1930s. So for Follett, integration was a method by which power over relations are transformed into power with relations at the group level, such as a conflict between labor and capital. And she was completely devoted to applying these ideas to the conflicts that she saw in her society. So the integrative process involves actors bracketing off structural and hegemonic relations between them in order to refocus their conflict on what each party genuinely wants, and to promote collaborative dialogue through which the desires of each side can be realized in the context of common overarching ends. Parties have to make a transition from group antagonism to group difference. And so they have to stop seeing themselves in terms of the structural relations that they view themselves as representatives of, and start seeing the group as people with differences. And from that starting point, they can work out creative solutions that meet the genuine interests of all in a unified, albeit not uniform group. So first people have to enter collaborative dialogues. This is a recipe she had. People had to enter collaborative dialogue in small groups, workers and managers, let's say, as individuals with a diversity of interests and experiences, rather than as representatives of larger groups or as mouthpieces for ideological perspectives, unionism, employers. And then within these small group settings, groups have to reevaluate what each side genuinely wants. So this reevaluation articulated in these reevaluated articulated interests loosen the power over mindset in which the initial interests of each party have developed. So Follett reasoned that people often discover upon reflection that their interests are compatible with the interests of their adversaries, that they want the same thing, or that they can work out a way of wanting the same thing. Through collaborative dialogue, parties come to distinguish between, on the one hand, what they genuinely want, and on the other hand, how their group loyalties, their desire for status, their belief in power over have distorted their interests. All parties come to understand what she calls the facts of the situation. And the facts of the situation is that the other side is not going away. So that you are with who you are with. And then the third stage of integration was where they engage in reciprocal elucidation of the circular process, in which they participate by working out new creative solutions. Ideally, creative solutions satisfy the genuine interests of all parties, and together with integration, have larger community values. So she hoped that this process, if followed in the workplace, would lead to gradually increasing the share of the workman in the, here I quote, in the actual control of industry. But it was a process, not the outcome. But it was the process, not the outcome that mattered. So she said the joint control of industry may be established by some fiat, she optimistically said, but it will not be the genuine thing until the process of joint control is truly learned. So that's the labor capital relations. In terms of the nonviolent movement, that is a very interesting side story. One person who did pick up her views probably more than anybody else is Richard Gregg, who offered a faithful and inspiring interpretation of her ideas in his publications in 1928 and 1934. Gregg was also a labor lawyer, also a Harvard graduate. He ended up being a labor consultant in Chicago and Boston and New York in the 1910s and 20s. And then he got really disillusioned because he thought that there was not going to be an end to the violent conflict. So he left the United States and he went to live and work with Gandhi in India. And he left with probably having read Follett's ideas, he ended up coming back and publishing 2 books in which he talks about Follett. And these books were both responsible for bringing Gandhi to the United States and explaining to an American audience Gandhi's ideas. One was called Gandhi's Satyagraha, and the other, which was is called The Power of Nonviolence, which is the more famous of the 2. He extensively discusses Follett in it. He says, MP Follett shows that either voluntary submission of one side, struggle and victory of one side or the other, or a compromise are all highly unsatisfactory and productive of further trouble. She then explains a fourth way, which she calls integration. I don't have time to go through it all, but it is the case that possibly with some of the ideas of integration in mind, Greg convinced Gandhi to change his tactics from ones that were more controversial and led to more violence to ones that were much more what we associate with Gandhi and the Salt March in 1930, which were really attempts at integration and really attempts to get over group antagonism. And those were the attempts that Gandhi has made famous. Greg's ideas left an imprint on Indian politics. So did Follett's ideas, by the way. She was also picked up by C.S. Das and other legislatures in India. But also in American politics, especially through the work of Martin Luther King Jr., who turned to Greg and Gandhi for guidance in developing his philosophy of nonviolence to fight racial apartheid in the United States. So that's the presentation, and here's the question: what happened? Like, what's that? Why is Follett remembered primarily in terms of modern capitalist negotiation theory and management studies? Where is this person in democratic theory? Well, there's a couple of ways of looking at this. She has been picked up. What's changed, of course, is the situation, the economic logic of what's going on in the labor negotiation theory. People are no longer really interested in management as a power source. They're interested in shareholders, and that's kind of shifted things. Also, the way in which people have come to be educated to understand their role in negotiation has changed. And it's changed partly because unions are much less powerful, but also that the group concerns that emerge in contemporary negotiation theory are, in one theorist's perspective, usually expressed in terms of social identities and not economic class. More than that, we are taught in negotiation theory to value the way in which our identity contributes to the organization. That is the value creation of ourselves. And in this context, workers are encouraged to think in terms of themselves as their own source of value in order to negotiate the dilemmas they confront in the workplace while surviving precarious employment. So this idea of power, the idea of power that Follett had just is completely distorted and weird in that context. And that's probably why when she is mentioned in modern negotiation theory, she is all of the socialist aspect, all of the democratic aspect is not there. It's about win-win, and it's about me winning against my employer, not us winning against the employer. But the other reason is that Follett has been remembered in the way that she is, might have something to do with the fact that she's a public philosopher. And that is that she was writing philosophically, yet she was very engaged with concrete social problems. That specific thing is a great thing, but it did lend her work to two audiences. On the one hand, it lends it to business leaders. And for those people, she offered a pragmatic approach to constructive conflict designed to solve conflicts in the workplace without disrupting the basic structures of the system that the parties inhabit. To a more radical audience, Follett called into question the basic features of our social system and our political system, including a social discourse that supports power over and obscures relations of codependence. She outlined a radical approach to participatory democracy, participatory legalism, to federalism, and to the idea of the state. She encouraged participants to realize that power over relations can only give rise to solutions of domination and compromise, neither of which is long-lasting. Parties will just retreat until the next day, until they're stronger the next day. And she also invited her audience to see these relations and outcomes as patterns that reinforce themselves in all social interactions, from workplaces to schools to legislatures to international conflicts. So, thanks.
So happy you introduced us to your current research, not only because Follett is such an innovative and intriguing thinker, political thinker, but also, in a way, the early 20th century, is such a wealth of innovative ideas that still speak to some of the fundamental challenges we face today. Right? So in this respect, it's not a book about history, but it is very much about some fundamental issues of politics and public philosophy that we pick up from there, bring into our contemporary world. And, Joey, we can think about a center for circular process, something like this.
Yeah, that's right.
That might be obvious.
No, Oliver.
No, Oliver, it sounds sexy. So, let's get started. Here.
Super interesting stuff, Abigail. So one comment first, and then question. So the comment, I guess one of the things that you're doing in this work about Mary Parker is highlighting the various ways in which she was a pioneer and things were picked up later, right? So maybe here's two more associations that came to mind, right? So when you said the thing about you become something different through the group dynamic, right? When you look at Charles Taylor and others in the interpretive tradition, the philosophy of science, they say, well, you need to really understand what's going on in a human society. You need to understand how individuals interpret themselves and are linked with the practices and institutions they're involved with. The two cannot be separated. So, that's an idea that's older than Taylor, is probably older than Follett too, but she's a link in that chain. Right?
Excellent.
And the other one is, there's lots of people today who say, look, we make better decisions in epistemic diverse contexts, right? So it's a problem when our central bank boards are all, old white males who study finance. Right? We need diversity. We'll make better decisions, and that seems to be present in philosophy. So, question. One question I have is about scalability. So a lot of what she seems to emphasize is about integration at a relatively small group level. So at some point you said neighborhood is the epicenter of cooperation. Also these negotiations within firms that happen at a relatively, we see eye to eye. Right? But what does this mean for the market as an institution? What was her idea? What were her ideas about what role the market should play in our society? Because the market has this capacity, or so many people think, to coordinate people who have diverse ends, right? In a context where they don't need to meet each other. They can, I can interact with someone at the other end of the country, at the other end of the world through a transaction, and we don't need to engage in this interaction at a personal level. It seems to be very important for Follett, but that is absent in the market. And we could discuss whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but what does she think about that? And so I have another one, but maybe I'll come back later.
So that's an interesting question. I got to put that down because I have to think about that. I don't know that she's not anti-market. But she is, she didn't talk about the market because she wanted to talk about relations as in terms of cooperation. She didn't believe that relations were cooperative, but that, so I don't know the answer to the question, and I also don't know the answer to the global dimension of that question. So the global dimension of the market. Her perspective is, in my mind, much clearer when applied to politics, where I think social cooperation is more seamlessly, possibly, you can see it more seamlessly. So instead of talking about the market, Peter, and I'll look up that to see what I can find about that. She was interested in the organizational culture of business. And that organizational culture was one that ought to be cooperative. But the exchange relations that you're thinking of, that's something I don't know the answer, like I'm trying to think about that, yeah, so I think that that is something that I need to brainstorm with you about what it could be. Because I don't think that there's anything in her lectures that would help in
Matt? Stand him over. So Matt, good first.
What do you need, Oliver? What do you want me to decide?
Good question.
Gosh, I guess how to ask, what I'm conscious of is that the questions that a talk like this invites, and the talk that's incredibly wonderful, are kind of imaginary questions about who we imagine Mary Parker Follett to be and what she might have said, rather than like really dealing with the substance of the work that you've done with Mary Parker Follett. And I'm just kind of worried that my question is more of the former than the latter one. But I guess I wonder what kind of resources there are in Follett's thought to think about euphemization, kind of tacit knowledges and understandings, conspiracies of silence. Because when I think about like a lot of like critical post-war sociology, like from Irving Goffman through to Pierre Bourdieu and others, a lot of it is about social interactions as performances, as requiring a kind of lack of knowledge of what's really going on backstage. Bourdieu talks about social relations as tacit conspiracies of silence, which is totally obvious to you, you know, like little kids, that's the problem that they pose to social relations, because they call everybody on everything. Hey, you farted. And no, you know, that's why your mom on the way to like dinner tells you all about the things, you know, Uncle so-and-so is going to say some things that are really bad, but no one here is going to say anything about it. But that's, you know, the euphemization is just absolutely kind of fundamental to groups. That's how kind of groups survive. And then you add to that one of the kind of like really important kind of critical discoveries of the last 30 or 40 years has been the way in which various kinds of microaggressions are basically euphemized forms of power over, masquerading as power with. And then, so the problem of, and you think about all the kinds of intentional communities that would have been inspired indirectly by Mary Parker Follett through, you know, the Beats, the hippies, it's, you know, these ideas are everywhere, right? This is one of the kind of things that they discovered. That you've got all this talk about power with, where the group, this is so cool, we're not affected by the any of it, but they're relying on the euphemization, whether they know it or not, of all kinds of really dastardly power relations, typically of race, gender, sexuality, coloniality, and so on. And so they're kind of, I better stop. But so the response to these problems, right, is to try to make everything uneuphemized, to render everything explicit. And so let's get self-conscious here. Let's talk about that. Let's have a process. Let's have a rule. Can groups, in the way that she wanted groups to be groups, kind of survive this pervasive process of de-euphemizing and disenchanting the euphemized things that used to make groups possible?
So your question is kind of interesting, because at first I thought, oh, okay, I know, you know, that the euphemization is just a form of what Gregg and what Follett would call suppression. Freud would call suppression, which is where they get it from. And so, but then the idea of the response to the euphemization is to make everything really explicit, which is actually just another way of getting people to suppress what they really think about what's going on, and to to suppress constructive. At least that's how I thought it went, because that's what ends up happening, right? So it could end up happening that it's not, that it just suppresses. So both of these thinkers are, and I don't know if this is a satisfactory answer to the question, so please come back to me, but both Greg and Follett were very hostile to suppression. They thought, and their work is very informed by this guy named Edwin Holt and Gustave Le Bon, who were people who brought Freud to the United States and to Harvard, and the idea is that suppression, and so this is the suppression doesn't last. You can suppress, but it will come out. And it will come out in various different ways. So the microaggression aspect of your question is just a perfect example of that. People euphemize, but really what they're doing is they're suppressing, right? And they're letting it come out, and it comes out anyway. And then we're told to be explicit about it, but then that just becomes another sort of exercise in suppressing of another kind. And all of these things that end up happening in our society or in our organization, we do them and they don't solve the problem. And so in a sense, this is exactly what Follett is talking about. You can do that. You can get people to compromise. You can do balance of power. You can teach them how to suppress. But the problems, the conflicts will not go away, and you will never get to that point of creative solution. So the real question, I guess, is how do you get to those creative solutions? And how do you create an environment in which people are not suppressing? Because that is the real trick. And that's not what happens in our institutions. It's all about suppressing.
So we have Sten, Marlia, and Amanda. Same unit.
Yes, thank you, Avigail, for this very interesting talk. I have two questions. The first one is, so there's an evolution in economic theory about how corporations are perceived, right? So at the very beginning, we have...
Oh, speak slower so I can hear you.
Sorry, maybe I can, I mean, actually, if I touch my last one, if you don't mind, but yes. So we have, at the very beginning, we have sort of like Adam Smith vision of the corporation. You know, corporations are evil, and the market is awesome. You know, and his main example is the East India Company, so you can understand his perspective. And then you have, you know, John Stuart Mill, who is like, oh, you know, corporations are necessarily evil, and they will democratize eventually, so it's going to become good. And then moving on to this sort of like institutionalist analysis of how corporations are an extension of the market, right? So I'm wondering where you place Follett on this sort of like spectrum. And so my second question is, so I'm generally, so you mentioned at some point, or you know, like there's a disinterest in management and focus on shareholder, right? In how we think about the corporation. So as far as management theory is concerned, I'm not sure that's true, because there's a general thinking now about how, you know, managers can behave ethically, what is an ethical management, you know, what's an ethical form of management. And so the main problem that this type of theories reach, in my opinion, when they're trying to kind of you know, integrate diversity of perspectives among shareholders and so on, is that the community that the corporation forms is usually quite very loose and tenuous, right? So you mentioned at some point, you know, like people don't really leave, or you know, people are not going to go away. But actually, one of the main problems is that they do, right? So very often when shareholders, stakeholders, you know, employees, workers, contractors, whatever, they have a conflict. The main thing they do is, you know, they resign and they go away. This is especially true in industries where we have, you know, low cost of exits and low cost of entry. And this is one of the main reasons, you know, why you know, workplace democracy, shop floor negotiations is so hard to incentivize a lot of industry, right? And so it's true, you know, that market behavior and corporate type of behavior, you know, like relations between stakeholders and so on, is possible only because of values and norms of interaction that are outside of the firm, right? There's a really cool book by Abraham Singer called The Form of the Firm on this topic. It's very nice what he shows, you know, that instrumental economic behavior is piggybacking, on non-economic norms of interaction and non-economic social relations. It's really interesting. But nevertheless, I do think that one of the main problems is that with incentivizing negotiations, stakeholders, dialogue or whatever, is precisely this, right? That people enter a corporation because they have instrumental reasons to do so, right? And when they reach a problem, it's usually far easier and far cheaper to just leave rather than bothering with any sort of conflict. And perhaps I would personally think that this is what we want, actually. This is what we want, certain type of conflicts, not all, but certain type of conflicts to be managed. And so I was wondering, so it's a broad question, but I was wondering what Follett had to answer to this type of concern.
So at the time that Follett wrote, people were not doing that.
Right.
There was just not mobility of that kind. And I don't know that that mobility was even imagined. What people, and in fact, the vision was that the unions would grow larger and larger and larger. And that you can change communities. I mean, but you couldn't really change, you could change jobs, but you'd be in the same union, right? And you'd have the same ideas and problems structuring your workplace. So the world was, in that sense, different from what you're describing. But to tell you the truth, Stan, I'm wondering if the world is so different from this, because you can change jobs. Take the university job, right?
Yeah.
You can change jobs, but that's going to be the same stuff over and over and over and over, right? There's no one big union, but it's the same logic of organization. It's the same conflicts. It's the same social dynamics. And so the question then becomes about ways of solving conflict. I mean, I think that that's really why this stuff has become partly about management studies, because we don't have the world vision anymore. Globalization is a bad thing, right? We don't have this possibility. And this person wrote at a time where she was doing battle with people who were opposed to the League of Nations, because they saw that as a cooperative venture that states would have to give up something in order to, and she said, no, don't you see, this could be great. This could be like one government. But I don't think that anybody really thinks that anymore. Okay, so now that's the anti-Follett, like the criticism of her, right? But in terms of a more, the more use that she can be, like the way she can get us to think is that what we have is not the only thing that could be. And that what we have, including the state and including particular kind of corporate structures within our workplaces, are all power over relations, where we're told that when we get compromise, it's a victory, but that's not a victory. And so this reminder that that's not a victory, that there are a different way to structure relations, that possibility exists, is what I find appealing about her. But that the amount of work that takes is massive. And it's an educational program that has to start within neighborhoods. So I think your question is fantastic and way more complicated than I can do justice to in my answer. But that's the idea, and that's the direction I would go in attempting an answer.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Abigail, for an absolutely fascinating talk. It was wonderful to hear it as a full talk. I've heard little snippets over coffee.
I bored my friends with
No, it's like in
constant,
anticipation of the full talk today. So I really enjoyed that. Abigail, just one quick question and then kind of follow up link to that, depending on how you answer. I wasn't completely sure what you were saying in terms of her contributions to or her reflections on Taylorism. What was your point about that? And then depending on what you say, I have questions.
She was, so what Taylorism became, it started off, as you probably well know, as Frederick Taylor bringing a stopwatch into a plant and saying, we're going to get rid of these nasty, random, arbitrary, tyrannical managers. We're going to use scientific techniques like timing. And he has this guy digging coal. There's this picture of this guy digging coal and this other guy with a lab coat and a stopwatch, right? And this was going to be this liberatory technique that led to legislation in many states against bringing stopwatches into workplaces. So what Taylorism became by the 1920s is a society, after Frederick Taylor died, a society where people who are interested in labor management, labor capital relations would go, including people from unions, to discuss how workplaces could be better managed. And that was really the time that Follett would go to some of these society meetings. She wasn't a member of them. Richard Gregg was, interestingly, because he worked as a labor consultant. And so he did go to Taylor Society. And the more progressive wing number of people who went there would recommend things like worker consultation councils.
Exactly.
And and Follett was not in favor. I mean, they're better, but they're kind of like multicultural accommodation. Like they're better than what they create a less intense kind of repression for workers. But Follett didn't think that they were very progressive, or people weren't thinking large enough, big enough. And they saw these as just, these were mechanisms of trying to get consent out of people. I liken it, I was very attracted to that idea because I've done research on the duty to consult, which is in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and how there's a lot of literature on how good consultation is and how getting Indigenous consent is great. And I've written against that, right? So this is the same thing. It's just like, it's the art of persuasion. It's just having power over people in a different way. And what you're trying to do is get consent, get someone's vote, get them through, this sort of act of consultation. That's really how she thought about it.
So she would have been critical then of how Taylorism ended up evolving and being implemented in those factories.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So two things then I wanted to ask you, and you've touched on it a little bit now, but maybe just to pull it out a bit more. To what extent were her ideas actually taken up in what we see emerge in places in Europe in terms of workers' councils? One could argue on the one hand that workers' councils, and many people do, are a good example of more consultative processes. It's a way that workers can be integrated into decision-making processes while avoiding the more conflictual relationships that define union and union management relationships. It's a way that workers can participate in broad-based decision-making about the culture of the workplace, blah, blah, blah. So we see workers' councils emerge in a number of European countries as alternatives to unions. We see that idea then taken up more recently in a number of global south countries. So South Africa is a good example where it's written right into new labor legislation in the post-94 period. And South Africa and South African, people drafting new legislation are looking at what's happening in Europe and looking at some of the examples of workers' councils. So my question to you would kind of be threefold, and I know it's hard to put on the Mary Follett hat today and say, okay, so really three questions. One is, to what extent have you seen a link between her ideas and the emergence of workers' councils in various European countries? Or is there such a gap that it's not really a direct link? Or is there a link in terms of her ideas and the emergence of? And then second, if you're able to, and it might be difficult, would she then see the emergence of such kinds of organizations today at a very local factory level in a positive way, as actually being an example of what she's arguing for in terms of integration rather than antagonism? Or if you have her kind of insights, would she see this as an illusion of integration? Which a lot of workers and labor activists who are critical of these say this is an illusion of integration, an illusion of workers actually being able to participate in decisions, but the core decisions around the way this factory is really structured and what the wages are and what the working conditions are not negotiated in these councils. They're negotiated in unions in what has to be really conflictual relationships because management and workers do not have the same vision. And very lastly, if I can, and you can answer only one if you want, I've been absolutely fascinated by what's happening in the States recently, and then also a number of other countries around the world, where we see the reemergence of local community-based centers and worker centers as alternatives to unions, as a way to both organize and represent precarious workers, migrant workers, and immigrant workers. I've done a lot of reading. I mean, Janice Fine and a gazillion other people who, not a gazillion, but many, who are working on and focusing, tracing these community centers and community centers in the States. And I have not seen links made to the earlier community centers that you talked about, that she was very active with, that do actually have many, are engaged in some of the activities today as they were when she was involved. Job placement, assisting with labor negotiations. The links that people make now in terms of those community centers are to the civil rights movement, they're to other kinds of community-based organizing. They're not to the kinds of community centers and the movement that you were talking about her being instrumental to. Is this an example of people simply ignoring this history and the impact of this woman in her thinking? So in fact, does this underscore part of what you're saying in the talk? Or is there not really a link between those early centers and the more recent kind of emergence of such centers?
Okay, hold on. I'm unfortunately the guy with the stopwatch.
Yeah.
That is the end of my question.
You're not allowed to have that.
My answer is very brief.
Yeah, that's great. We have two more questions.
Excellent. And actually, I'd really like to hear everybody's questions if you have it, and if you don't get a chance to ask them, please email me because I am interested in this dialogue. Marlea, you've answered your first two questions. Because which I thought you did a much better job than I could, giving why Follett might be attracted to these worker councils and why she might not be. I mean, I think that you've laid it out and kind of reflected really well my understanding of how I would answer that question. I have been told, and I will do it, to ask Thomas Piketty about this particular, to think about this in relation to his work, because he's very in favor of workers' councils and representation. But I don't know enough about how they actually operate as you do, and maybe as Peter does, to know how to analyze that better than, and the community center point, yeah, that's really a good point, and I hadn't thought about that, and I know those community center labor organizations as alternative to unions are really important, and I have to look into that as well, so I will be, but there's a lot of people who these people can draw on, and usually our imaginary just stops at World War II, we don't go exactly further. Thank you.
Mine is not going to be as well articulated and very simple, but similar to Marlea's question is just how Mary would have conceptualized the integration process on a larger scale.
Right. So, and this, I'm glad you asked that, because that's kind of this. I'm going to morph that with the scalability question. That because I can answer a little bit of what Peter brought up too, which is, so the neighborhood is the epicenter of democracy. She thought that neighborhoods ought to be represented, not that it should be the neighborhood, because that's where we have the social relations. And then you scale up, right, to cooperative societies that involve multi-neighborhoods, to municipalities, to provinces, to the state, the new state. But here's the rub, and that is that you can't, if you don't do it through the integration process, through this kind of broadening of circles, that is real integration, you just get power over relations, or they're not genuine. It's not a genuine integration situation. So we can have lots of groups. There's no problem with groups, but if they're just groups of atomistic individuals that kind of bump into each other, that engage in competitive relations, that's not integration. The idea, though, is that through these psychological processes, through these social processes, and through our interaction and capacity to change each other, we can actually grow.
So it's concentric.
It is, and so she did a lot of research on cooperative movements. So cooperative banking, cooperative farming, the cooperative commonwealth, which is something that I want to look into next. And so it's this kind of growing idea.
That requires a community.
It requires, yeah, it has to start somewhere as well. You can't impose it.
I'm looking at the watch. We have 2 more minutes, and I'm a bit hesitant to come up with my question, which is about framing, because we have a lot about community, but not really anything about the commons, right? Which seems to be more. Maybe you could just give us a sense, because as you said, it's the beginning of a conversation and dialogue, right? And we're going to have you a bit longer here at the center, so there will be more opportunities to discuss it. But maybe you can give us a snippet of how the commons is often a term really more to a form of economic governance of common goods, right? And community speaks more to political philosophy about democratic processes and preferences, permission preferences, and so forth. Could you just give us a sense how you want to link these and the role of the commons?
Yeah.
If you haven't already, so
No, I haven't already, and in fact, that's what I said to Jody. When you prepare a presentation and you kind of have an integration process with yourself and you come up with a new idea. That's kind of what happened to me last night. And I just went, oh my God, I have to really rewrite this whole thing now. So the idea, but to be short, because I know everybody wants lunch, in a minute. The idea of the commons that I'm really interested in, that idea has become too elastic. It's become everything. And I don't want it to be everything. I want it to be grounded in the original economic analysis, in the following sense, that I'm trying to get at the idea that you can have a community where there is integration just insofar as people actually come together to follow a set of emerging rules. Okay, so that's emerging ways of interacting, but that is grounded and limited by the resource. In some ways, grounded and limited. In Ostrom, Eleanor Ostrom's work, it's in an economic analysis, it's grounded by that resource. There's only so much you can do with water. There's only, before it all dries up, right? So sharing this water system just imposes limits on us. But as we cooperate in the commons, we come to not only share, but we change. And we become integrated, but we don't become a kind of common organic whole. And so it's that limitation, it's between those parameters that that's the idea of community I'm interested in. And with Follett, how I'm interested in deploying that is by thinking more about the idea of diversity, these ideas of labor and capital, the idea of ethnic diversity that she was working with, that those things are both something that is part of creative innovation, but it's also something that imposes limitations. Maybe that's even the wrong way of putting it now that I say it, but So that's what I'm interested in. That's very ambiguous, but it's in process.
And that I can definitely see how it relates back to your previous, research interests. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you online, guys. Abigail, thank you.